In mid-February 1943, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel occupied his command post near the Tunisian border, composing correspondence to his wife, Lucy. His forces had recently achieved a decisive breakthrough against American positions at Cassarine Pass, and while the Africa Corps celebrated their victory outside, Rommel remained inside, analyzing the intelligence he had gathered about his new adversaries. His written assessment was remarkably candid and unflattering toward the American forces. Rommel's evaluation characterized the Americans as inadequately prepared, insufficiently trained, and led by officers whose tactical errors would have resulted in court-martial proceedings in any European military establishment. He had just witnessed American forces disintegrate at Cassarine Pass, resulting in over 6,000 American casualties across 6 days of fighting. Entire battalions had surrendered, and substantial quantities of equipment had been abandoned on the battlefield. The collapse bore striking resemblance to the French military's performance in 1940. The defeat at Cassarine represented more than a tactical setback for American forces. It constituted a profound humiliation. Soldiers who had been raised on heroic narratives from World War I found themselves questioning their fundamental capability for combat. Rommel perceived not merely a tactical advantage, but what he believed to be the deterioration of American morale occurring in real time. He communicated to Lucy his assessment that if Germany could mount another offensive within weeks, they could drive the Americans from North Africa entirely before the American forces developed proper combat proficiency. This assessment was transmitted to Berlin with a clear recommendation to exploit American vulnerabilities immediately and deny them the opportunity to adapt. Rommel's evaluation was not rooted in prejudice, but rather in systematic observation of American battlefield performance. At Cassarine Pass, American forces had demonstrated numerous critical deficiencies. Their commanders had positioned units inappropriately, radio discipline had collapsed under combat pressure, and coordination between infantry and armored units had been essentially non-existent. When German forces initiated their attack, American units retreated without authorization, creating cascading waves of panic throughout the defensive positions. The American Second Corps commander, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, had established his headquarters in a canyon approximately 70 miles behind the front lines, communicating via radio and telephone without maintaining visual contact with the battlefield. His orders proved confused and contradictory. Intelligence officers compiled comprehensive reports noting that while American equipment was adequate and American soldiers demonstrated courage when cornered, the American command structure remained fundamentally amateurish. These were not soldiers with prior experience facing the Wehrmacht. They were learning warfare in real time against Germany's most experienced units. Rommel calculated that the Americans would require at least 6 months to address their leadership deficiencies, and probably 12 months to develop effective operational doctrine. If Germany struck again in March, he anticipated results similar to those achieved at Cassarine. German armored doctrine had proven itself against every opponent since 1939, based on the principle of concentrating superior force at weak points, breaking through with armored spearheads, exploiting the breakthrough with mobile formations, and forcing the enemy to either retreat or face encirclement. This doctrine had shattered French armies in 6 weeks, destroyed Soviet armies in 1941, and pushed British forces across North Africa twice. The formula succeeded because most armies fought defensively, attempting to hold lines that German mobility could bypass. Cassarine Pass had demonstrated that the Americans employed the same approach. They established defensive positions and waited to be attacked. When German armor concentrated against weak sectors, American forces retreated rather than counterattacking. Rommel studied the terrain around El Ghoutar in central Tunisia, determining it was ideal for another demonstration of German tactical superiority.
If German forces attacked there in late March, they would encounter American units still recovering from Cassarine. The psychological advantage alone would prove decisive. Berlin approved Rommel's assessment, anticipating that one more offensive would break American morale completely, allowing Germany to shift forces to face the British, while Americans withdrew their defeated army. German intelligence reported a command change in early March. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. assumed command of 2nd Corps on March 6, 1943, the same corps that had collapsed at Cassarine Pass. When Patton arrived at 2nd Corps headquarters, the atmosphere transformed before he issued his first order. He arrived with a siren-blaring motorcade, wearing his famous ivory-handled revolvers, and he did not merely issue orders, but delivered an ultimatum that the era of the defeated American soldier had ended. Patton implemented strict discipline, requiring men to wear ties and regulation helmets in the desert heat, not from vanity, but to remind them they were professionals rather than defeated refugees. Officers who arrived without proper uniform were fined immediately. Soldiers who failed to salute received public reprimands. The German assessment concluded that one general could not rectify systemic problems in 3 weeks. Patton might marginally improve morale and enforce better discipline, but he could not teach an entire corps new doctrine in less than a month. Rommel's health was deteriorating. His stomach ailments and exhaustion were worsening. However, his tactical mind remained sharp. He reviewed the El Guitar attack plan one final time before transferring operational command to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. The plan assumed American defensive tactics, American hesitation under pressure, and that 3 weeks was insufficient time to transform an army. Every assumption appeared logical based on German experience against every other opponent. On March 22, 1943, German forces prepared to attack American positions near El Guitar. The German order of battle included the 10th Panzer Division with Mark IV tanks and the experienced Italian Centauro Division. German commanders briefed their units on expected American responses, anticipating that Americans would defend from fixed positions, call for air support that might not arrive when German armor concentrated, and retreat under sustained pressure, as they had at Cassarine. The German tanks possessed superior firepower and armor protection. German 75mm guns could penetrate Sherman armor at 2,000 yards, while Sherman guns required closing to 500 yards for effective penetration. The technical advantage in firepower appeared decisive in open desert terrain. German artillery prepared fire plans to suppress American positions, and the entire operation was designed to exploit what had succeeded at Cassarine. On March 23, 1943, dawn broke over El Guitar. German forces advanced, expecting another victory. They were about to discover that 3 weeks had been sufficient time to change everything that mattered. The German attack commenced at 6 a.m. Lead elements of the 10th Panzer Division advanced toward American positions held by the 1st Infantry Division, known as the Big Red One. Visibility was excellent, and terrain was favorable. Everything matched the operational plan. Then, American artillery opened fire. Rather than ranging shots or scattered fire, the Americans delivered coordinated, time-on-target salvos that dropped multiple batteries on German positions simultaneously. Every gun in 2nd Corps could concentrate its fire on a single point at the exact same second. This level of artillery coordination was something German forces, still relying heavily on horse-drawn artillery, could not replicate.
The accuracy was shocking, and the volume was devastating. German tanks took direct hits, and radio operators heard urgent calls from infantry units requesting medical evacuation. The Americans were not suppressed, but were firing back with precision that suggested professional forward observers and experienced artillery crews. The 10th Panzer Division continued advancing, as this was expected resistance, and German commanders anticipated Americans would break under sustained pressure. They ordered units to push through the artillery and close with American positions.
American tank destroyers opened fire from concealed positions, and German Mark IVs began taking flank shots. The Americans were not defending from obvious positions, but had positioned anti-tank weapons to create crossfire that made German armor vulnerable regardless of facing. By 9 a.m., German forces had penetrated 2,000 yards into American positions, which was normal for an offensive, but the Americans were not retreating. They were conducting fighting withdrawals to prepared secondary positions. For the men of the 1st Infantry Division, El Guatar represented more than a battle. It was an exorcism. They were the same soldiers who had been humiliated at Cassarine Pass. As the 10th Panzer rolled toward them, the big red one did not look for an exit, but focused on their sights. They had traded their fear for cold professional rage. German radio intercepts picked up American communications. The tone was professional and calm. Officers were giving clear tactical orders. Units were reporting positions and coordinating fields of fire. This was not the panicked radio chatter from Cassarine Pass. American infantry held positions under German fire until ordered to withdraw. When they withdrew, they moved to new positions and resumed fighting. They were not running, but executing tactical retreats that preserved unit cohesion while making German advances costly. The Italian Centauro division on the German right flank reported heavy resistance. American counterfire was pinning their infantry. When Italian units advanced, American machine gun positions opened fire from overlapping fields. The Americans had prepared the battlefield properly. By noon, the German advance had stalled at 3,000 yards. This was not the breakthrough Cassarine Pass had led German commanders to expect. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim commanded German forces in Tunisia after Rommel's departure. He received reports from El Guatar at his headquarters indicating the attack was not achieving objectives. American resistance was organized and effective. Casualties were mounting without corresponding American collapse. This did not match the intelligence assessment. Von Arnim studied the tactical reports with growing concern, recognizing that something fundamental had changed. The Shermans were still outgunned by German armor, and the terrain was not dramatically different from Cassarine, but the Americans were fighting with coordination and aggression the German commanders had not anticipated. Radio intercepts revealed American officers giving confident tactical orders. Artillery was concentrating fire with devastating precision. Infantry was counterattacking instead of retreating. This was not the panicked radio chatter from 3 weeks earlier. On March 24th, von Arnim recommended calling off the offensive. German casualties were significant without achieving breakthrough. The Americans were too strong in their current positions. The attack was suspended, and German forces withdrew. German intelligence worked to understand what had happened at El Guatar. They interviewed captured American soldiers and studied documents recovered from the battlefield. They needed to know what created the transformation.
The Americans had not received new equipment or significant reinforcements. They had not trained for months in new tactics. The change happened in 21 days under Patton's command. Patton's method was simple but radical. First, he implemented a leadership purge, firing officers who hesitated and promoting men who attacked. Command positions went to officers who understood that speed and aggression won battles. Second, he instituted a doctrine revolution. Every unit learned to counterattack immediately when attacked. Artillery concentrated fire to achieve overwhelming effects at decisive points. Defense meant aggressive patrolling and spoiling attacks, never passive waiting. Third, he orchestrated a psychological transformation. Patton convinced soldiers they were superior to their enemy, not through speeches, but through training that rewarded aggression and punished caution. Units that performed well received public recognition. Officers who failed were relieved immediately. The entire corps learned one lesson: attack succeeds, hesitation fails. German commanders analyzed what El Ghoutar revealed about American capabilities. The Americans had adopted a doctrine that neutralized German tactical advantages. German doctrine relied on concentrated armor breaking through weak points. American doctrine responded with mobile anti-tank weapons positioned to create crossfire. German advances became costly regardless of armor superiority. German doctrine assumed defenders would retreat under sustained pressure. American doctrine taught immediate counterattacks that disrupted German momentum. What looked like victory suddenly became a fight for survival. German doctrine emphasized technical superiority and tactical excellence. American doctrine emphasized coordination and overwhelming firepower. The Germans prided themselves on the individual skill of the panzer commander. The Americans countered with the industrial might of time-on-target artillery strikes. It was a mechanical symphony of violence. For German infantry, it felt like the sky was falling. They were not fighting individual soldiers, but a coordinated machine that had finally found its rhythm. The Americans were not trying to match German technical advantages, but making technical advantages irrelevant through superior coordination. Rommel had written revised assessments before leaving Tunisia. The Americans had learned faster than any opponent Germany had faced. They had identified their weaknesses at Cassarine and corrected them in 3 weeks. Any future offensive against American forces would require significantly more resources and different tactics. On March 6, 1943, 2 critical events occurred simultaneously. In Tunisia, Rommel launched his final offensive in North Africa at Menonine against British 8th Army. The attack was a 1-day disaster. British forces stopped German armor cold with coordinated anti-tank fire. German casualties were heavy, and the offensive collapsed within hours. That same day, George Patton assumed command of American Second Corps. Rommel's exit and Patton's entrance occurred at the same moment, and the changing of the guard was symbolic. 3 days later, on March 9th, Rommel flew to Germany on sick leave. His health was failing, and his jaundice and exhaustion were worsening. He would never return to Africa. Before he left, Rommel wrote updated assessments for German commanders remaining in Tunisia. The tone had shifted from his February letters. He warned that American forces under new leadership were showing rapid improvement and that any future operations against Americans should not assume they would break as they had at Cassarine. Rommel's warning came too late. The attack at El Ghoutar on March 23rd confirmed everything he'd predicted. German commanders who ignored his assessment discovered the Americans had transformed completely. However, Rommel was in Germany when his warnings were vindicated.
On May 13, 1943, German forces in Tunisia surrendered, with over 250,000 Axis prisoners taken. The North African campaign was over. The Americans had progressed from humiliation at Cassarine Pass to victory in Tunisia in less than 3 months. German commanders studied American performance and issued new tactical guidance, warning defenders to expect aggressive American tactics with rapid armored advances and concentrated artillery. The Germans were adapting their doctrine. When Allied forces landed in Sicily on July 10, 1943, those warnings proved accurate. American forces under Patton's 7th Army advanced rapidly up the western coast. Patton's forces reached Messina on August 17th, beating British forces in a race that made American arms look superior. German defenders reported that American tactical aggression combined with superior logistics made defensive operations nearly impossible. In June 1944, Rommel commanded German forces defending France against Allied invasion.
He deployed defensive doctrine specifically designed to counter American aggressive tactics. Rommel positioned mobile reserves close to likely invasion beaches because he knew Americans would push inland rapidly after landing. German forces needed to counterattack immediately before Americans could establish momentum. Rommel's assessment of American forces had changed completely from his February 1943 letters mocking their softness. He now wrote that Americans had shown themselves to be very much more advanced in their tactical thinking than the British. Their forces combined material superiority with aggressive tactics that made static defense ineffective. When D-Day came on June 6, 1944, Rommel's defensive preparations were undermined by Hitler's refusal to release panzer reserves. However, Rommel's tactical assessment proved accurate. American forces at Utah and Omaha beaches pushed inland aggressively, despite heavy casualties. Rommel understood what other German generals were still learning. The Americans were not the soft, poorly trained force he had defeated at Cassarine Pass. They were a professional army with doctrine designed to exploit material superiority through aggressive application of force. After Germany's surrender, Allied interrogators interviewed German generals about American military performance. The testimony was consistent and revealing. It read like a confession. When men like Hasso von Manteuffel and Albert Kesselring sat in interrogation rooms in 1945, a recurring theme emerged in their notes, a begrudging, almost startled respect. They had expected Americans to be like the French or early Soviets, slow to learn and easy to demoralize. Instead, they found an opponent that evolved at a speed that felt unfair. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded panzer forces against American armies in 1944 and 1945, stated that Americans learned faster than any army Germany faced. They identified weaknesses and corrected them within weeks, not months. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring testified that American artillery coordination was the most effective he encountered in 6 years of war. The speed with which Americans could concentrate fire on tactical targets made German tactical doctrine obsolete. German generals emphasized that American transformation was not about better equipment. Soviet armies had excellent tanks, and British forces had experienced soldiers, but Americans combined material advantage with aggressive doctrine that made their advantages decisive. The consensus among German military professionals was that American forces in 1945 were dramatically different from American forces in 1943. The same army that lost at Cassarine Pass had become one of the most effective fighting forces in history. They did not just lose the war, they lost their sense of superiority.
Rommel's initial assessment after Cassarine Pass was logical based on German experience. Armies needed years to develop effective doctrine. Officers needed extensive combat experience to lead effectively. Soldiers needed months of training to fight professionally. Patton proved that assessment wrong in 3 weeks. The transformation showed at El Guitar, but it took 90 days from Cassarine Pass in February to the surrender of Tunisia in May for German commanders to fully accept that American improvement was permanent, not temporary. The first 3 weeks changed the doctrine. The next 2 months proved the change was irreversible. By May 13, 1943, when over 250,000 Axis prisoners surrendered, German generals understood the Americans who had broken at Cassarine were gone forever. Leadership mattered more than experience. Doctrine mattered more than equipment. Aggressive mindset mattered more than technical superiority. The Germans built better tanks. The Americans built better doctrine. When the two met at El Guitar, doctrine won. It won again in Sicily. It won in Normandy. It won across France and into Germany. The 90 days between the shame of Cassarine and the triumph in Tunisia changed the course of the century. It was the moment the arsenal of democracy found its sword. German generals stopped underestimating American soldiers because by May 1943 they realized the man across the foxhole was not a tourist but the architect of their inevitable defeat.